Lots of people love to make music in their free time, but not everyone has the money to start recording it. If you just want to get your foot in the door and you have an old USB headset lying around, this might be the project for you. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to turn one of these into one of these. This was actually a project I did a while ago, but I thought I'd make another one to show other people how to do it too. Bear in mind, this project is going to require a fair amount of problem solving on your part, but if you're up to the task, it's a great project to do. It's very useful. For this project, you're going to need a variety of tools and materials. Ideally, you can use most of what you have on hand, so you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of things, but depending on what you have available to you, you might have to buy some things. However, try and avoid that if you can, since that kind of defeats the point of this project. First and foremost, you're going to need a soldering iron. Now, if you've never used one before, now probably isn't the time to start. That being said, however, there are lots of tutorials online if you're willing to learn, and you can pick up a cheap iron on Amazon for less than about $30. Next step, you're going to need a drill and a couple bits. The bits we'll probably be using are 1/4 inch and 3/8 inch bits. However, yours may require more than just these two depending on how you choose to build your project. In addition to a drill and a soldering iron, you're going to need a few hand tools as well. This includes wire cutters, needle nose pliers, some screwdrivers, and whatever else you might need to assemble your particular project. Now for materials. Most importantly, you're going to need a USB headset. Now, probably any headset would work, but I've only done this with USB headsets, and that's the way that I think it's easiest and most useful. There's mainly two more things you need for this project, the first being a 1/4 inch audio jack. Sometimes in certain audio equipment you can find these inside and salvage them for this, but I think the easier way to do it is either to buy one from an electronics store or a music store, or to build one using two small, thin metal strips that you can bend easily. They can't be too thin because they need to retain their shape pretty well, but they can't be too thick because you need to be able to bend them into the right shape. I find that this galvanized hanger strap works pretty well. You can find it at most hardware stores and online as well. The last major component you're going to need is a potentiometer, or a pot for short. This is literally just a volume knob. These are very common, and you can find them inside a wide variety of devices, or just buy one online from an electronics store. Lastly, you'll need an enclosure to put the project in. You can buy a project box online, but I'd recommend making one yourself. You're also going to need a variety of small screws if you're making your own audio jack. You're also going to want to make sure that the front of your enclosure is thicker than the shortest screws you plan to use. For this reason, try to use as short of screws as possible. A good rule of thumb for this project is that if you don't already have most of these tools and materials lying around, this project probably isn't for you. However, it could still be a fun challenge. Now on to building it. The first thing I want to do is find where the mic is on the headset. It's usually at the end of an arm on one side. Once you've found where the microphone is, open up that arm and try to find what the wires look like connected to the microphone. Once you find what color the wires are, write it down so you can reference it later. Next, find the USB end of the headset and follow the cord upward toward the headset until you find a small box on the wire. Open up this box and look at the circuit board inside. There should be two distinct sides of this board. On the side of the USB connector, there should be 4 or 5 small wires. On the side closest to the headset, there should be a lot more wires connected. 2 of them should look identical to the microphone wires. Once you've found the microphone wires inside, go about 6 inches up the cable toward the headset and cut it. Set this aside for later. Before you do any cutting or drilling, the first thing you want to do is lay out the inside of your enclosure. If you don't know where all your components are going, you won't know how big to make the enclosure or where to put holes. It usually helps to draw out the enclosure on a piece of paper so you know what you're going for. Once you have a sketch, you can then dimension the sketch so you know what size to make all your parts. When choosing the materials for your enclosure, make sure that the front of it is thick enough that it can accept the screws for the 1/4 inch jack. And also, make sure that wherever you put the potentiometer is thin enough that you can screw it onto the panel. You also have to make sure that it's not too thick, or else it'll prevent you from being able to connect to both parts of the audio jack. Once you have your enclosure all dimensioned and laid out, you can cut out the parts. Always be sure to exercise caution when using sharp blades and power tools. Now that the parts of the enclosure have been cut out, we can start to mount the potentiometer. For a panel mount pot like mine, take off the knob on top by unscrewing the set screw on the side of the knob. Once you have that off, you should have access to the nut on top of the potentiometer that keeps it pressed up against the panel. Unscrew this with a wrench. This should free up the potentiometer so it can be taken out. You might have to cut some wires to get it out though. Next, you'll need to figure out what size the mounting hole needs to be. You can do this by holding different drill bits in front of the threads of the potentiometer until it's bigger than the threads. Once you've found the correct size drill bit for your potentiometer, drill a hole in the panel where you want to put the pot. To mount the potentiometer, put it through the hole just like you found it, and then screw the nut down on top securely. Next, if you would like a knob on top of the potentiometer, screw it back on top just like you did when you took it off. The next step is to mount the audio jack. If you bought an audio jack or you found one inside of something else, go through the same process as you did with the potentiometer to mount it. If you're like me and you're going to make your own audio jack, you're going to need to follow this process. First, drill a 1/4 inch hole in the front of the panel that you're going to put the jack in. You want to make sure that you can put a 1/4 inch audio plug in it without too much resistance, but without it being too loose either. If there's too much resistance, try drilling the hole again and moving the bit around to loosen up the hole. Next, you'll need to bend those 2 metal strips into 2 contacts that touch either part of the plug when it's inserted. To help you figure this out, I've drawn a diagram. You need the first contact to barely press against the plug near the bottom of the hole. This can be done by bending a piece of metal into a slow curve that goes a little bit past the edge of the hole, pressing onto the side of the plug. For the other contact, do about the same thing, but make sure it doesn't touch the side of the plug. You only want this one to touch at the very end inside the notch. By bending the metal strip so that it notches inside at the end, it will click into the plug when it's inserted, and it will provide resistance to keep it from falling out. This part is likely going to take a lot of tweaking and trial and error, so don't be afraid to do it a couple times until you get it just right. You want to make sure that both pieces of metal are making good contact with the plug when it's inserted. The next step is wiring. To help you with this, I've drawn a schematic. On this side, we have the input, the jack. On the other side, we have the output, the microphone connection. Not all inputs are created equal, and some are much louder than others. For instance, the signal from an electric bass is far louder than the signal from a microphone. To make sure that all of these different types of signals can be heard and that none of them damage the device, we add a volume knob in the middle. Solder the jack wires to 2 opposite pins on the potentiometer, leaving one in between them. Then, solder what used to be the microphone wires to 2 adjacent pins on the potentiometer, with one of them overlapping with the jack connection. To connect your wires to the jack contacts, unscrew the screws a little bit, take a stripped portion of the wire and put it underneath the screw that's been unscrewed. Then tighten the screw back down to hold the wire in place. Now that the wiring is complete, you can finish assembling the enclosure. If you're unsure about it working, you can skip to testing now before you finish the enclosure to make sure that it'll work before you seal it up. Be sure to cut a hole in the back of the enclosure for the USB cable to come out of. Make sure the hole is big enough that the cable can fit through comfortably, but make sure it's not so big that the cable can be pulled out the back. If you're having problems with this, putting a zip tie around the cable on the inside can help. To finish my enclosure, I use nails to seal the top onto the sides, and the sides onto each other. I used these tiny needle nose pliers to hold the nail in place while I was hammering it in. So, your audio interface is finished. All that's left to do is test it. All you need to do is plug it into any USB port on your computer, and it should show up as the headset in your computer, since that's what it actually is. You can record and edit the audio using a wide variety of programs, a lot of which are free, for instance Audacity or Cakewalk by BandLab. To select the input, just find an input selector and find which one corresponds to the headset microphone. The beauty of an interface like this is that it can take any input that comes out to a 1/4-inch jack like this. This means you can plug in guitars and basses and any other electric instruments like that have an output like this, or you can use a microphone. So these are tape recorder microphones. You can probably get these at a thrift store for really, really cheap, and most of them come out to a 1/4-inch output right there. Another option is to buy a new microphone. You can get cheap knockoffs for about $15 like this one that comes with a cable that comes out to a 1/4-inch output. There's a lot of different ways you can use these inputs. For instance, you can use a microphone to record an acoustic guitar part. Seems like it's working pretty well, but let's see how far we can push this. Let's add some other instruments. But it wouldn't be complete without percussion. As you can tell, this thing is pretty flexible, and in my opinion, a lot more useful than an old headset. Hopefully you at least learned something new. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you later.